to invite our keynote speaker, Ben Kite, to come up to take the stage to give his talk. Ben will be known to many of you. He's a chartered ecologist and director of the long-standing independent ecological consultancy, and it was named in the 2025 ENDS Power List as one of the 100 most influential ecologists or environmental professionals in the country. So we're very fortunate to have Ben. I've had a look at his slides and I can see that we're in for quite an exciting ride with this as well. So thank you, Ben, for doing that, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, I have to say. For me, this feels a bit like a coming home because my career in nature conservation started about 25, 26 years ago here in Surrey. I was a dormouse monitoring volunteer working with Dave Williams, who was the mammal officer at the time. I think I've been invited to come and speak today because I've had a bit of an interesting year last year. I was elected in 2016 to be the Strategic Policy Panel Chair for an organisation called the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. That's the institute that represents professional ecologists and environmental managers in the UK. It's got about 10,000 members. And I accepted the appointment gratefully, thinking it would be a fairly easy gig. And then along came Brexit, and we've been in a state of constant policy flux concerning the environment and nature conservation ever since. And obviously last year was a period of great change with the introduction of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which is now obviously an act. And my talk really focuses on the experience that we had trying to make representations on behalf of the nature sector to that process. I've called it, I focused the talk on the notion of community because I think that's really what the government's been getting wrong in its approach to nature. And I'll explain a bit more about that as we progress. I'm going to be channeling this gentleman a little bit during this talk. He's one of my sort of heroes in nature conservation. He was an ecologist in the sort of 30s, 40s, and I think early 50s in America following the Great Depression. And he was one of the first people really in our sort of field that began to realise that we were taking too much and doing too much damage. And he had a bit of a revelation in his career that a bit of an awakening really. And as a consequence, he came up with an idea called the land ethic, which is enshrined in two of his key books, the Sound County Almanac, which is his main life's publication, and Round River, which was published posthumously. I put that quote up there because that's the one that appears you see everywhere that probably a lot of ecologists and nature conservationists know. But actually his wisdom goes far deeper than this, and I think is very relevant to the changes that we're experiencing today. So I wanted to bring some of that out through my talk if I could. So for me, this all began in 2024 with some fairly ominous rumblings. The first time it really caught my attention was when the outgoing chair of HS2 on the 7th of November 2024 pointed the finger at nature conservation and environmental protection as being a key reason why HS2's budget was spiralling from the original estimate of 37.5 billion to 66.6 billion, and it's still rising. I think we're on 80 something now. And he said that he pointed to this well-known infamous bat tunnel that's being delivered to try and protect a maternity colony of Beckstein's bats, and he said that he was forced to spend £800 million on that, despite there being no evidence that trains will interfere with bats. Remember that, because I'll come back to that later. Suffice to say, I don't think he was particularly on the money with that statement. The Prime Minister then doubled down on this, and so did the Chancellor, with various comments. I've put two of them up there, which began to vilify and, in my view, scapegoat nature for some of the problems. Now, I should put my cards on the table at this point in time and say that I'm somebody who believes that we do need to build quite a few more houses, and also that there are meaningful reforms that can be made to nature conservation legislation and planning policy to streamline and expedite some of the decisions that we make and reduce costs and burdens. But I think there's a right way to do that, a way to do that with nature in mind, and I don't think the government has hit the target in what it proposes to do. I'll tease out a bit more detail on that in the next few slides. So all of this sort of preparation that was going on in the media eventually came to a head when this document was put out in February 2025, this working paper for development and nature recovery. And it was a bit of a head scratcher, at least for me, because it was very internally conflicted, or I felt it was. It pointed the finger at Great Crested Newts for holding development up, whilst at the same time holding up the district licensing scheme for Great Crested Newts as an exemplar of how Great Crested Newts no longer held development and nature conservation up. So it was a very strange document. I felt that at its core, it had a principle that had merit. And that was that the state could set up effectively a rapid mechanism for pooling developer contributions to deliver mitigation measures at scale, or nature enhancement at scale in planned areas where where nature markets, things like biodiversity net gain, habitat banks, weren't responding fast enough and development was being delayed. So the principle, I don't think there was anything wrong with. Really, it was the execution that was important. And there were a number of serious unanswered questions in this paper. Worrying statements that led me to believe that perhaps they weren't really doing this with nature in mind, as being on a par in terms of needing that win-win between nature and development. So off I went on behalf of SAIM to give evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee in February 2025, and I was surprised to see that I was sat alongside some other professionals from other parts of the planning world, the planning sector, including the RTPI and the Institute of Chartered Surveyors, the ladies sat next to me, and even more surprised to discover that we were all basically saying the same thing, that this mechanism had, the idea had merit, but that there were some worrying things in the working paper that left nature potentially vulnerable to some of the decisions that were going to be made. And I think my colleagues on the bench there had other concerns as well related to community involvement in decision making and other things. That evidence session didn't really achieve anything meaningful for quite a while, because hot off the press, the government published the draft Planning and Infrastructure Bill on the 11th of March, a mere 2 weeks and 2 days after they closed the consultation on the working paper. So in my view, there can be no meaningful consideration being made into all the feedback during that consultation. They knew what they were going to do, and they were going to do it regardless of what anyone said. And the bill was quite horrifying at this early stage, at least in my view. It created this idea that there would be that developers would be able to effectively sidestep the protections in the habitats regulations in exchange for paying into a nature restoration fund that would then be spent on benefits elsewhere. And at this point in time, all the safeguards that we'd all been arguing for were entirely absent from the bill. So there was no deadline for delivering those measures. There were no principles in terms of needing to take into account evidence or the conservation objectives of sites that would be harmed. Effectively, the only real test in there was that the Secretary of State could only allow this process to take place if he or she believed that it would lead to an overall improvement in the environment. And that was a very broad brush at this point in time. There was no focus on the particular environmental features that were going to be harmed by the developer. It was just a very subjective, will there be an overall improvement? So my colleagues and I at SAIM were horrified at this point in time, and began doing what we could to try to engage with parliamentarians, civil servants, anyone who would listen effectively, to try and influence the passage of this bill, and also to try and make sure that the nature conservation NGOs were aware of really what this meant, so that they could leverage their networks to try to influence it as well. And there was a ramping up of the sort of PR at this point in time to scapegoat nature for delays in development. And I think it's fair to say, quite a lot of misinformation. So this was Keir Starmer in March blaming the distinguished jumping spider for blocking Ebbsfleet Garden Village, 15,000 homes in Kent. And of course, the story is a nonsense. Basically, what happened was the Ebbsfleet Garden Village wasn't allowed to extend into an adjacent piece of land, which was a SSI for not just the distinguished jumping spider, but a lot of other very important things as well, an entirely inappropriate place for development. So in my view, these stories were being generated and twisted to kind of fuel this agenda and this idea that nature was the problem and nature protections were the problem. Fortunately, there was a bit of a pushback on this. George Monbiot, in particular at The Guardian, ran the counter story and put the views of nature conservation sector down. And this, I think it's fair to say that this particular article that I've got on the screen really triggered a major change in the way things were headed, the trajectory of the debate. Because up until now, I think the government took the view that it had such a big majority in the Commons that it could push through whatever it liked and there was nothing anyone could do about it. But the growing sense of public concern and the concern of large nature conservation charities in particular began to change that. And this was also a key moment. The Office for Environmental Protection was not asked to provide a view on the emerging planning and infrastructure bill, but it was so worried, I think, that it decided to do that anyway. And it published blow-by-blow legal advice on the implications. And in that letter there said that in our considered view, the bill would have the effect of reducing the level of environmental protection. This is in May. Now, that was a really important intervention because on the front of the bill, there's a statement from the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government that said, in my view, this bill isn't a regression in any environmental law. But that's a statement that they're required to make under the Environment Act. And of course, here you have the government's nature conservation watch, or environmental watchdog rather, saying precisely the opposite. So I think at that point, the government had to do something. So it summoned all of the various nature organisations that were campaigning for changes to the bill to a meeting. I wasn't present, but SIME's CEO, Sally Haynes, was, and I think it's fair to say she was fairly horrified by what happened at that meeting. Effectively, government, civil servants working on behalf of the government offered a reset in relations, but then immediately indicated that the nature sector would be shut out of decision making in future if these amendments that were being tabled effectively as an ultimatum weren't accepted. And there was a lot of pressure put on nature conservation organisations to stop campaigning in exchange for these amendments. I think response was varied. Some charities, some organisations did sign a statement cautiously welcoming the government's proposed amendments. Others, including my institute, SIME, decided that they wouldn't sign it because, although there wasn't much time given, we could see some obvious loopholes in those amendments and ways in which they didn't really provide the reassurances that they were meant to provide. I've put some of the amendments up here. This isn't all of them, but we don't have time to go into them into detail. Some of them were positive and helpful. So, for example, the overall improvement that is required if an EDP is going to be used now has to relate to the particular environmental features that are being affected, and the overall improvement needs to be judged to be material. But there's still all sorts of loopholes and weasel words buried in the bill that, in my view, mean that most of these are window dressing amendments that don't really provide the reassurance that they're meant to provide. So, for example, if you take the current habitats regulations, the wording of them is that an authority can only consent a plan or project that will have an adverse effect on the integrity of an internationally important site, if they've established that it wouldn't cause an adverse effect on integrity. That's now effectively reversed in the Planning and Infrastructure Act, which says that the overall improvement is passed if the Secretary of State considers it to be passed. So whereas previously the decision was obviously had to flow from the evidence in the legislation, now the arbiter of whether or not a particular evidential threshold is met is the Secretary of State, and there's no real pushback or opportunity to challenge that in any way. There were some other positive introductions made, so they now have to provide, the Secretary of State must provide remediation measures if an environmental delivery plan fails to deliver an overall improvement. But again, there's some serious flaws, in my view, in the legislation, because the first mandatory reporting period is halfway through an EDP in year 5. At that point, you might say, well, it's not working, the overall improvement's not being delivered, we'll tweak it a bit and change it and hope for a better outcome. And then the next reporting period is at the end. So by that point, you've got 10 years potentially of accumulated environmental damage before in year 10 you say, oh dear, it didn't work, we now have to remediate. And the remediation doesn't have to be delivered if the cost is judged to be disproportionate. So on the face of it, these amendments were meant to be reassuring. But on my reading, at least, I don't believe that that's the case. I think that it makes the bill better, but it doesn't make the bill, or the Act as it is now, good enough. Other things like Natural England now has to have regard to the best available scientific evidence when writing an EDP, but really worrying omissions like regard doesn't have to be had to that evidence when the decision is made whether or not the EDP is actually made, i.e. adopted. Why? Why? So there's a whole host of things in there and a lot more. If you go to SIME's website, we still have a planning and infrastructure hub web page that provides all sets. You can download all of our briefing notes basically that we sent to peers and MPs to try to flag up some of these concerns. The Office for Environmental Protection wrote again following the amendments to say that that they substantially alleviated the OEP's concerns, and that but that the bill on balance still represented a regression in law on the face of it, and wouldn't say any more. They didn't publish blow-by-blow advice on whether or not the amendments actually addressed the concerns that they'd raised previously, or to what extent, or which ones they were happy with and which ones they weren't. So this was the end of it for the OEP. I'm not going to take you through all of these because I don't want to burn up all the time, but these are some of my concerns as to why the amendments just don't go far enough. I've covered the subjective and notional nature of the overall improvement test, and the fact that the Secretary of State doesn't need to take account of best available scientific evidence when the decision is made whether or not to actually make an EDP. The Act is completely silent on what happens when there is no scientific evidence. So you have to take account of the best available scientific evidence, but what if there isn't any? There is a risk, in my view, of environmental features being aggregated. So they have to name specific features that are being covered by an EDP, and that the developer is effectively allowed to harm by paying into the bill that will then provide compensation somewhere else. But I think there's a potential problem where you could wrap up things into collated features, so an assemblage of bats rather than an individual species, and then accept some losses to some species within the assemblage because some other species within the assemblage are going to do better. It's a sort of classic way that people who write environmental impact assessments badly try to conceal certain impacts by wrapping them up as part of a bigger feature. I don't think that risk has been adequately, I'd love to be wrong, by the way, but I don't think that risk has been adequately edited out of the Act. Various other things. So there is actually no requirement in the Act for Natural England to physically deliver the mitigation measures that an EDP requires. They are required to write EDPs, to consult on them, to monitor them, to report on them, and they are required to, quote unquote, spend money. But not all the money, not most of the money, minus their administrative costs. And there's no actual requirement for them to physically deliver the things that they need to deliver. Now, when I queried that, the answer that was given to me was we can't do that because it's likely that Natural England will be subcontracting out most of these measures. And we said, well, why not have a clause that requires them to use reasonable endeavours to either deliver or secure the delivery of those measures? And there was deafening silence in response to that question. Various other things that I'm not going to be able to go through in detail, but suffice to say there were a lot of concerns raised and more misinformation. So and also sort of worrying false characterization of the issue. So at this point in time, in October 2025, the Chancellor again was speaking at an industry event and said that some snails, which are microscopic and that you couldn't even see, were holding up 20,000 homes. And this is part of what George Monbiot has termed the cauldron species agenda. So if you're going to hold up a species to vilify, to try to hold up development, it has to be something that you might find in a witch's cauldron, like newts or spiders or bats, or it can't be orchids or dormice or or the New Forest or things that people love and care about. But actually behind this story was a really serious issue, that the Arun Valley was running out of groundwater, and that the protected sites in the valley were likely to be negatively affected by that. And that, of course, has knock-on effects with human well-being. We need potable water from the chalk aquifers in that part of the world. So if we're running out of water, it's a very serious issue, and nature's really just the canary in the coal mine. We were successful at this point in time, around about this point in time, in provoking a miniature rebellion in the House of Lords, we managed to get 2 amendments in particular voted in the House of Lords, but they were unfortunately stripped back out again when the bill went back to the House of Commons. So peers got the message and did what they could to patch up the bill, but the House of Commons, removed those interventions. We subsequently found out that a briefing paper was circulated to MPs that was leaked online, which contained what was, in my view, some significant mischaracterisation of what the bill did and why the concerns that people like me were expressing weren't relevant. I wanted to put this one in. I did say I would channel Aldo Leopold in reference to the cauldron species. So this is quite a powerful quote from Round River. He said that the last word in ignorance is the man who says of an animal or plant, what good is it? If the land mechanism as a whole is good, then every part is good, whether we understand it or not. If the biota in the course of eons has built something that we like but do not understand, then who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and every wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. This is wisdom from the 1940s, and I think it's as relevant today as it was then. I tried some more. In September, I was invited by Sarah, that's the Labour Environments campaign, to be a guest speaker on a panel discussion at the Labour Party conference. And I did my best to raise some of the concerns that the sector had about the bill, but unfortunately those were given short shrift. You can see there, there's the infamous MAGA hat on the desk there, which Steve Reed, who up until that point had been Environment Secretary, by then had been made the Secretary of Communities and Local Government and responsible for delivering the government's building agenda. He'd had some kind of Damascene conversion to being a developer. And that those hats were being handed out that said "Build, baby, build" on. My concerns were given short shrift, despite the excellent chairing of Barry Gardner, the MP in the centre there. And you will notice that another lady on there, Julia Baker, who's present in this room and talking later, she also sat on this panel and was very much saying very similar things to me in terms of the bill needing to be improved, and also pointing to some of the fantastic opportunities that were coming down the line if we really re-engaged on that win-win, which was what the government claimed it wanted. Use development to drive nature recovery, and take the opportunity for land use change and investment that development brings to create habitats at a really significant scale. On 23rd, I think some of my slides might have somehow slipped out of order, but they were in chronological order. I think I've gone back 2 days, but we went up and we had some very positive discussions with the Prime Minister's policy unit as well in number 10. These are colleagues from SIEM here, and the lady in the purple jacket is SIEM's CEO, Sally Haynes, and you have SIEM's president and head of policy there as well on the other side of me. And I think we were pleasantly surprised at this point in time about the positive reception that we were getting, but we subsequently left the meeting agreeing to speak further, and later found that 2 of the 3 policy staff that we were speaking to had been moved on. I'm going to have to accelerate a little bit because I'm running out of time, but George Monbiot came back at it with further articles, and this ramped the pressure up still further. I'm going to just use a little bit of the time that I've got left to cover some of these bogeyman projects that the government's been holding up as a way of justifying the attack on nature. These are things like the infamous Bat Tunnel, which I mentioned, the HS2 Bat Tunnel, the fish disco at Hinkley Point C, where millions of pounds are being spent protecting fish from being sucked into water intakes, the Ebbsfleet Garden City, I've talked about already. I'm not going to go into the bottom 4 of these in any detail because there isn't time. I just want to focus on that infamous Bat Tunnel. So in 2013, the reason I know about this is I actually did some digging for some policy work that I was doing at the time into the documents that were submitted in conjunction with HS2. The environmental statement in 2013 said this, that there is a particularly high risk of collision with Bechstein's bats with passing trains. So that's interesting, given that that document was produced by HS2, and the chairman of HS2 said that there's no evidence of Bechstein's bats being hit by passing trains. But at this point in time, the structure, the Bat Tunnel, was envisaged as a box-shaped enclosure, so presumably not something one would expect to cost £100 million. But by 2023, when the planning application was actually submitted to build the tunnel, a design and access statement was submitted, which pointed to a number of complexities, which seem to have had an effect in elevating the cost. So the width of the tunnel was expanded to cover the existing MCJ line. There were difficulties due to unstable ground associated with an adjacent landfill. And the key one here is that the design and access statement now says that it's not sufficient to erect a nakedly utilitarian box in the hope that at some point in the future it will no longer be seen. And instead, we're now referred to concepts of the sublime in 18th and 19th century aesthetic philosophy. And we're told that these are closely related with romantic movements in art, and that the bat tunnel design now might provoke a reaction of this sort. So it's no longer a naked utilitarian box. It's some kind of manifestation of an oil painting, an 18th century oil painting. This was actually put in the design and access statement, this painting, as ostensibly inspiration for the tunnel design. And there's all of this pompous intellectual self-gratification in the design and access statement, which explains how a utilitarian box-shaped structure supposedly now looks like this image in the bottom, which includes Bibo arches, rigid perforated panels, portals, wing walls, integrated service compounds, whale equipment buildings, etc., etc. So how much of this is actually to do with protecting nature? I think probably not much. The Financial Times took a look at this and decided that there were other reasons, shall we say, that probably that the cost had inflated. And they also compared what we're doing at HS2 with what the Japanese have done with the Shinkansen, for example. So those drawings up, those pictures up there, the left is the Colne Valley Viaduct, which has been engineered on a bespoke basis to look like supposedly like a stone skipping on a pond, whereas in Japan they took a far more utilitarian approach to the engineering. And for some reason, HS2 were reported to have spent £20,000 on Lego. I'm not sure why that's relevant. There's no time to go into it in any detail, but if you want to know the real reasons HS2 overspent, then the government actually commissioned a review on that called the Stewart Review. These 11 points here were his key findings, and although the bat tunnel is discussed under a couple of them, it doesn't seem to be a main reason. If you remember at the beginning of the talk, I gave evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee. At this point in time, in November 2025, the Environmental Audit Committee published its report. It's a very interesting report, but basically it gave the government a warning. It said that it must not veer down the path of viewing nature as an inconvenience or blocker to house building, and that using nature as a scapegoat meant that the government was actually less likely to be able to tackle the genuine challenges that are slowing up the planning system. The Fingleton Review is what we're going to deal with in the future. This was the nuclear review that the government wants to adopt and also roll the recommendations out to other forms of infrastructure project. Have some fairly worrying recommendations in there, like modifying the habitats regulations to remove barriers to development. Fortunately, the government seems to have backed down. Last week, it published its response to the Fingleton Review, and it seems to be going to take these recommendations forward through guidance rather than a further planning bill. So hopefully there might be some scope finding a bit more of a happy medium when we take this forward. We'll see. Looking forward, I'm going to skip over those. In fact, you can read these slides, but these were other things that were going on at the time, which sort of explain some of the context in which all of this was happening. One more quote from the great old Leopold: "Wherever the truth may lie, this much is crystal clear. Our bigger and better society is now like a hypochondriac, so obsessed with its own economic health as to have lost the capacity to remain healthy." I think that's very sort of telling of the times, really. These are all the things that are happening in 2016. Again, I won't go through them in detail, but the things that we're already looking forward to and trying to prepare SIME's scope for positive engagement. I say hopefully the government's back down from the worst potential watering down of environmental legislation. And I do genuinely believe that there is scope for a win-win, where we can deliver more development faster and work for nature as well. But there needs to be a fundamental revisiting of the idea of scapegoating nature as being the problem for why that's not happening. There are problems with the legislation and the guidance which are unnecessarily causing delay and cost, but it's the human implementation of that's the issue, not nature. And there are ways to do that without risking nature if we have a broad and wide consultation with the sector and come up with solutions together. This is a global biodiversity loss report that was suppressed by the government. It was supposed to be published in October 25, was delayed until 2026. We don't know why, but it is notable that that meant that this wasn't available when the debate was happening over the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. This is our king having his intervention, absolute masterstroke. He managed to get the Environment Minister to read out a speech at the United Nations Biodiversity Forum in Manchester, effectively saying that if we didn't look after nature, the economy would wither, which I thought was a brilliant way to sort of puppet what was going on. One more Aldo Leopold quote. I think I might be getting quite close to the end of my time. We shall never achieve harmony with the land any more than we shall achieve absolute justice or liberty for people. In these higher aspirations, the important thing is not to achieve, but to strive. I'm going to skip over some of these, but if we want a positive future, this is a good way. This is, I think, a good way forward. So the Town and Country Planning Association and Sheffield University convened a working group in January and came up with something called the Sheffield Declaration, which was a better way to do planning and to put purpose back into planning so that it works for communities and for nature, and it recognises that nature is an essential underpinning feature of a healthy society and a robust and vigorous economy. And I think if we want to do things better, this is not a bad starting point. This is SIME's efforts at doing that. This is a joint statement on nature that was sent to the government, signed by sort of 60 leading groups and individuals, asking for a reset on the way in which the government's treating nature and a more constructive way forward when we deal with these things in the future. This is my final slide, and this is where I wanted to come back to community. Again, this is all from Aldo Leopold. Conservation's getting nowhere because it's incompatible with our Abrahamic concept of land. We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. That land as a community is a basic concept of ecology, but that land is to be loved and respected is an extension of ethics. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, animals, or collectively the land. In short, the land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land-based community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. And I think if we could live up to some of that, we would have a far healthier and more prosperous society in future. Thank you for listening to me. Apologies, I've gone slightly over.
So we have time for a couple of questions to Ben. Hand up if you. There's a microphone card. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Hi. Okay. It seems to me that the problem fundamentally is compartmentalization. Do you have any views on how we might address that?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, no. I mean, in health, nature, all of everything is connected, obviously. As,
yes.
You know, it's being made clear. But fundamentally, policymakers don't seem to understand that. And that's really interesting to me as a human being who, you know.
I think you're right, and it's a phenomenon that occurs everywhere. So, you know, we subsidise nature conservation related activity, but the subsidies we pour into things that harm nature are far greater, for example. And the benefits that nature brings to health and well-being are not reflected in cost-benefit analyses of these things. The land use framework would have been a good place to start. So this has been something that's been trailed for a long time, where you bring all of these siloed thoughts and thinking streams from different government departments together, and you say, right, how do we mediate the use of land to the best effect? So instead of looking at a piece of land and saying, what's the most economic thing to do with it, you look at all of the value that it could have to humans. You say, what's the potential of this land to do good, whether that's delivering homes, food, biodiversity. The land use framework was supposed to do that. So I think this was cart before horse. We should have done the land use framework first, and that should have informed thinking on everything else that followed.
Sure. Are they looking just, say, like cost to the NHS of pollution-related illness, etc.? Is that all part of the thinking? Because it seems to me that it isn't.
No, not adequately. No, but I mean, this is one of the things I discovered, admittedly too late, in trying to campaign to influence the bill.
Yeah.
was when I started speaking to mental health charities that do outdoor social prescribing, this sort of thing, green prescribing. None of them were aware of the bill or what it meant for them and the health sector. And once they were, they were interested in influencing the bill too. So there is definitely nowhere near enough sort of cross-sector collaboration. There is scope to get this right, to deliver for the economy, for nature and society, but it does require exactly what you're alluding to, I think.
Thank you. I'll take one more question, lady over there, and we must move on.
Thank you. I'm Jacqueline Hill from Friends of the River Eden Ecosystem. I'm guessing, and I don't want to speak for everybody else here, but we share a lot of aims, similar aims. How can we support yours?
That's very, very kind of you to ask. I mean, the biggest thing really that we could have done with when we were trying to positively influence the bill was getting the message out there, because SAIM is a professional institute, a learned society. It's not a campaigning organisation. We don't have millions of members like some of the e-NGOs do. We're growing rapidly. I mean, I think this bill has caused our membership to swell from 7,000 to about 10,000 because people wanted to be part of a better answer, I think. But still, we're a small organisation with no network to reach people and help them understand what's going on. So what we tried to do was publish briefings and disseminate information on what was happening and what implications it had for people, and put it up there on our website, and then hope that other people picked it up and could leverage it in their own communication. So I think really what most people could do, from the types of organisations I would guess are here, is keep an eye on the briefings that we publish and do what they can to leverage that and disseminate that message.
Thank you very much, Ben.